structure. Here there are 7 points that I would like to present. The first is the character of the. The second is the definition of the. Third is the aim of the type of the cause of the transcendence notions of the, and the model virtue, both Ren and charity. Do you understand the meaning of this? Okay. So this is Chinese character. It's very beautiful and interesting. No? It is all by shapes. You can guess the meaning. What is the meaning of this? What is it looks like? Yeah, somebody said it's like a way, no? A road, or something about a side road. Yes, this is the way that we are going to walk between a road. And then there is a little, this is a progressive development of this character. And then there is a, you see this, what is the dog? Yes, it's the eyes. And the eyes, together with somebody is walking within the road. White with eyes. And later on, there's development. There is a heart down here. There is a heart, the shape of the heart here. And that is the meaning of zhi. Is the rector chord. Is the straight heart. Something like you have to be right, upright or hard. And together with walking with behavior. So at the end, the meaning is like this. The is comprised of an eyes. You see there's the eyes there. Here, there's the eyes. And now the cross and cross. The semantic signifier indicating the movement or conduct. Semantic signifier sing, the heart, indicating that the word pertains to an inner quality of a person's heart or mind. And horizontal line here between the heart and the eyes here. This one. Do you see? Okay, this probably originated from the connection with the great zhi and curve-shaped stroke underneath the eyes. The word described as morally upright hearts, thus considering it a weighty zhi conjoined meaning character. It's very interesting, no? And if you want to learn how to write there is a step of, actually for primary school students, then you can follow how to write first this, and then this, and then this, and then this. And then later on, so how we write one character is actually a lot of steps. Yeah. This is very beautiful, actually, learning the Chinese character. The definition of the St. Thomas Aquinas defines human virtue, which is an operative habit. It is a good habit, and operative of the good. Summa theologia. And there is 2 types of virtues now, also infused virtues. It's caused in us by God without any action on our part, but not without our consent. He works in every will and in every nation. However, Confucians believe that Dharma in Chinese philosophy is the inner moral strength of a person that can positively influence others. Virtuous action, integrity, interior in mind is virtue, carrying out in behavior. And there is also an inner and internal and external perspectives. The xing, that means moral behavior, and in the also by pronunciation, the is also to get in Chinese. So So it's also you have to obey to acquire this habit to take. The end of the purpose of awareness said the final and finished rules of virtue is identified as happiness. Virtues that God infuses in the soul are directed to the supernatural happiness, to anyone, and beatitude. In the same way that our natural inclinations lead to our natural end. However, Confucius believe that to become Junzi is our model, like the ultimate goal, saying that once we have a fullness of virtues, we can become a Junzi. That is a gentleman, is like a perfect guide here in Chinese explain like this. Someone who cultivated the virtues and acted accordingly. 君子怀德, meaning that 君子is kind of person with virtues, embrace 怀 or virtues. The cause of the Compass of Awareness said, all virtues are in us by nature, according to aptitude and inclinations, but not according to perfection, except the theological virtues which are entirely from without. Infused grace do not cause a habit. We remember that. But strengthening the already existing habit. So infused grace is very important to us. So we have, first of all, we have our human habit as a foundation, so that the infused grace work in us more perfectly. But also God can change with His almighty power, can do everything. But first of all, the most important thing is we have also established our human virtues as a base, as foundation of receiving infused virtues. God worked in us which God worked in us and without us also. So we have to prepare ourselves. And Confucius says the such virtue attracted the attention. This is very important, the difficult pronunciation. Anthropomorphize cosmic power. We call it here. It's similar to what Father said, Father Michael said, 天道 is the mandate of Tian. Because for Confucius, they believe that once they have the way of Tian, and there is the goal. And because of this goal, and we have to establish our individual habit to reach this goal. We call it heaven, which supported the sage's rise to political authority. The type of so all the mystic scholars knows that there are many types of virtues in the philosophical division. Intellectual virtues are the virtues that are rooted in a man's rational nature, and moral virtues are virtues that refer to human behavior. Cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice are virtues that are acquired. And the theological approach, faith, hope, and love, to build a relationship with God. And Confucianism, there's 5 main key notions of virtues. We call it 人以知性. This is the main nations. Actually, 人 is the main virtues, which actually you can say that once you obtain 人, you can have everything. You can perform all the virtues, which embrace all other virtues. And yi actually is righteousness. Without righteousness, you cannot behave well, according to the Confucius, in the society. and to the country. Li is also very important because we got it vital, something like some kind of like vital and cooperative. It's like the meaning that next speaker may speak about something about meaning, but it's similar to this Li. The concept is similar. Wisdom and trustworthiness. Then I don't have a profound explanation here because it's very similar to some of our virtues here. For example, prudence is zhi, and the temperance is li, fortitude is yi, justice is yi. And something very similar, but I will not explain very profoundly here because of the time. Number 6, the transcendence notions of the. So, according to the studies, many of the scholars believe that Confucianism doesn't have transcendence notions, which means it's because all the virtues of Chinese is all between humans. Dimension is all morally between humans, individuals, society, and the country. There's no such supernatural and transcendent concept like our Catholicism, Buddhistic traditions that believe that yes, transcendent notion reaching God. So I will explain a little bit here. So Thomas Aquinas said that in charity, the charity is for God is love as the cause of happiness, which is there's a person, God, who in God we love everything. But in Confucianism, we have to ascend, not descend, like Jesus descend. But we have to ascend to some perspective and standard that we, by ourselves, transcendence, by our effort. So that the three immortals, in fact, is something just morally between human beings and human virtues. I will explain more here. So that we can focus on comparing two concepts, Ren and charity. Thomas Aquinas, and he has a very good approach to explaining charity, which is the theological virtues, which is transcendental, supernatural love. But Ren, according to Confucius, is only natural love. For example, in Greek, agape, the love is charity, and unselfish love, higher than eros and fear. And it is very special that the Catholic and the Buddhistic tradition say we love the end. But in Confucianism, it is not obliged us to love God and to love our enemy and to love the sinners. This is the most difference between two of them. So in loving God, we love our neighbors. This is the key of divine, and that's the most difference between them. Lo Guang, I don't know if you heard about him. He wrote 43 Lo Guang Chuan volumes, all about scholastic studies, and putting his Confucians or Chinese culture background to present scholastic philosophy and theology, which is there's no translation yet in English, but it's very good volume to read. Lo Guang is an archbishop, and he was studying in Urbaniana and Guyana and Latino. He obtained 3 doctorates in philosophy, theology, and canon law. So he's very special because he analyzed and he put actually in practice and in the sense of inculturization that he put all what he learned from holistic traditions to present by his way as a Chinese scholar. He said, virtues is the behavior obtained from human nature. It is very scholastic. He said, not in knowledge, but in action. Virtues is not in knowledge, but in action. He said, the term virtue, morality, and moral is the same. This is what he defined. Habit that makes easier for a person to do good when he acts. He advocates that Confucianism does not conflict and is the same. I will conclude. So what awareness can give to the new Confucianism? It is what I have some conclusion about that. First of all, awareness can inspire the notions of loving God. Even the God that the Chinese believe is not a person, that there's no persona. Perhaps it's something about the way the logos, or something about the principle, or some more abstract concept in general. But awareness, holistic traditions, and introduce the notions of loving God, which is a person. The incarnation of the admirer and the transcendental being. Though the Tian is similar to God, found the love of friendship with God, supernatural being, morally tends to a common good, which has the aim of transcendent and supernatural. Which some common good, which is very important concept also, because when Chinese usually they reach common good, which is the good for the society and the good for the country. And the common good we can say it is God. What Confucianism can give to holistic ethics? The practical advice of Confucianism brings the believers closer to the reality, fulfilling the highest virtues of human law. Give practical advices and examples of behavior to reach the morality standard. People find a concrete way to listen and follow to become Junzi. Here I didn't give a lot of examples, but if you read our classic books, there's a lot of experimentation about human behavior, a lot of rules, a lot of regulation, a lot of moral standard that to teach us how to reach, for example, piety to the families, to our king, to our father, mother, and to our teachers, and to our neighbors. There's a very specific and very fine explanation. And that is my presentation. Thank you, and Happy New Year, because
Hello, my name is Carl, and thank you for other talks for inviting me to give a talk on the doctrine of the mean in Confucianism and St. Thomas. What can the ancient teach to the modern? Okay, three things. This is only a preliminary comparison. They are still in the process of development. Okay, so some of my observation research are not conclusive and can be general, and my talk focuses more on Confucianism. So the Chinese word for concept is zhong. Zhong means middle, and yu means to use. So according to this Chinese scholar Chen Lai, there are three major historical developments of the doctrine of the mean, and I'm going to go through quick. So basically, during the first stage, so the focus is more on the moral side. And during the Han and Tang dynasties, it's more on the political. Where during the Song Ming dynasties, it's more on the spiritual and also the formation of the inner being. Okay, I'm not going to go through the detail. So, for Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologiae and commentary on the Ethics are the two major sources for my research. So, beginning of the philosophy. Okay, for the Confucianism, using Aristotelian terms, right? Things are better known in relation to us, and things are better known to themselves. So, for Confucianism, so the beginning of philosophy really starts from things are better known in relation to us. Okay. For Aquinas, it's the other way around. What do I mean? So Confucianism emphasizes more on daily experience and common sense. It's practical and the action and value. Right? This means what? This means the question of the good takes more priority over the question of being. So we may immediately realize that for Aquinas, the question of being takes more priority over the question of good, right? So then we fall into this tension between metaphysics and political philosophy, which is a central notion, a central tension in the history of the West as well. So, but it's important to realize that there are two major contexts for why Confucianism began philosophy from things that are better known in relation to us, which is common sense and daily experience, etc. There's a famous saying by Confucius that if we don't know much about the present life, how do we know much about the afterlife, right? But the two contexts are important, right? The first is it is to refute the religious and superstition culture during the Shang and Zhou dynasties. The two dynasties, were before Confucius. But of course, Confucius lived through the second half of Zhou dynasty. So during that time, have you heard about Chinese oracle bones, right? So basically, the people during the Shang and Zhou, they do divination in everything, right? From war against the neighbor, hunting, and burning harvest, and natural disaster, etc. They all do divination. Okay. Confucius says, let's not start things from them. Let's start things from what are better known. Right? So this is very important because later I will go back to it. So the second context is that during the Tang and Song dynasties, so the Confucians faced another opponent, which were the Buddhists. So for them, to start philosophy from daily experience is to refute the metaphysical speculation of the Buddhists, right? Because they view the Buddhists somehow were a threat to Chinese political social structure. And this is why Zhu Xi says that something may echo to Hegel's view that the Indian tradition, right, and some of the Buddhism are sort of focused more on the illusion fantasy. So for Buddhism, right, the afterlife is more important than the present world. Where for Zhu Xi, a major neo-Confucian, he says the present life is better known, so therefore should be focused. Right, that's the difference. And these two cultural contexts are very important to understand why Confucianism start from the things are better known to us. So the political takes priority over the theoretical. For Aquinas, right, it's the other way around. He may agree that it is important to start from things are better known in relation to us than things are better known in themselves. But the point is to move from things are better known in relation to us to things are better known in themselves, right? Since experience self-proposition, Aristotelian metaphysical categories, etc. So in essence, that the question of being for Aquinas takes more priority over the question of the good. Therefore, the ends determines prudence. Of course, for Aquinas, in the end, that good and being are the same in God. So for Aquinas, right, is the theoretical is the foundation to the political and the practical. So I think that's a major difference we can think about between the two philosophies. So their comparison. What can we learn? What Confucianism can learn? Right? The scientific rigor. This is something I think is lacking in the Chinese tradition. And I think this is why, for a long time, Confucian tradition was not able to refute the metaphysical speculation from Buddhism, right? They don't have a strong scientific worldview. But, something perhaps the Thomist tradition can learn, which is, the unification of heaven and earth, where somehow, the unity of being tends to be forgotten, in the division of the science. So I think this would be contradictory. Excuse me. What can they teach us to the modern, right? We know that from Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, and Francis Bacon, eventually, especially Descartes, the ego takes over being and good. And or you see being and good become more separate. But that's not the case either in Confucianism or in Thomas Aquinas, right? So I think this is the first part. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that the reason why Confucianism or Taoism are attractive is because, in the midst of men's dominance over the world, as a Western mentality somehow, can be balanced out by more this sense of unification. So, okay, so that's important. The other thing is that common sense is very important for Confucianism, right? In today's debate, say a controversial issue, a Confucianist may respond. It is not just common sense. Okay, anyway, so I don't want to mention specific issues, so I realize academic lecture. So the end of philosophy for the Confucianism, right, is to be harmony in heritage. Bernadette mentioned. So there's a passage I'm now going to read from I Ching, Qian 23. Okay, why this is important? This is a logical consequence if there is to be a universal principle beyond social convention and some sort of relativism Buddhist for Confucianism, right? So eventually, you need a principle that is higher than social convention because nature takes priority logically and historically over men. The other thing is that heaven becomes the source of morality and maintains a degree of personality, so the just men may be eventually vindicated. There's a famous saying by Confucius is that nobody understands me except heaven, so somehow there is a degree of personal dimension. And especially during time that military victory becomes what determines right or wrong, right, during the time of Confucius. So he sees that's problematic. And third, that the mandates of heaven are not based on sacrifice, thus cannot be bribed, manipulated, as in the Shang and the Zhou dynasties. So basically, people during the two dynasties, they made a lot of sacrifices, almost every day, including human sacrifices. For what? So two reasons, right? First, they think that this personal being, can be influenced by men's sacrifice, and the second thing is that somehow, this being somehow has similar pleasure as men do. So Confucius, thinks no, let's separate heaven from all these sacrifices, right? Heaven as the highest being cannot be grabbed. And this is huge development, right, in the history of Chinese thought and also religion. And the third, that the political authority is no longer based on a mysterious fate, the moral virtues of the leader. And this is also a major development, because previously it is the military victory that determines who is the heaven chosen person, right? But then in Confucius, the logic changed to the moral virtue of the leader. The heaven decides things according to virtue, not according to your military strength or wealth. So these are the implications, right, for why heaven become the end of philosophy. And also another important point, the antidotation between nature and the good. Mengzi, has a view, a more positive view of human nature, that human nature is good, which has been criticized, right? But why he thinks like that? For two reasons, right? Evil is not part of nature, right? If evil is part of nature, then human perfection is not possible. And the second reason is that there is no better principle of being than the good, which echoes Plato's argument, where in the Republic he talks about good being the principle of being, right, or beyond being. And people interpret is that in comparison to all the pre-Socratic answers with regard to the first principle of nature, the good is obviously the most superior one. So I think similar thinking also takes place in the Confucianism, that why good and nature, they are interchangeable. And so for Thomas, right, the natural and the supernatural ends, they meet in God. There's only one happiness in God. And also the reductive, I'm going to skip this part. Okay. But different from Thomism, Confucianism thinks, different from Confucianism, Aquinas doesn't think that the final end is achievable in this life. A second, that the final end of man is not the unification with anything other than God. And the final end of man has less to do with politics, where in Confucianism, it is the central part, which is saying king is very important notion. A comparison. So I think, perhaps the Thomistic tradition can learn something from Confucianism, is that perhaps things that are less certain, less relevant to life, perhaps not to avoid, but be careful, right? That's one thing. But Confucian tradition can also learn strongly from Thomism that the certainty of end is so crucial. Without such knowledge, beginning and the meaning are not going to work, right? So we immediately can see there's a tension between the two traditions and the modern. Why? Because for Tom's Hub, man has to conquer nature, right, in order to survive. But for both Thomas Aquinas and Confucianism, perfection is the completion of nature. Also follows Aristotle. This is very important. So nature and good are interchangeable versus nature as beyond good and evil. Darwin evolution apparently doesn't think nature has any sense of good and evil. Okay, and also morality versus completion virtue versus morality and conventional historical. Okay, so basically we see in modern philosophy there's a trend. Human nature has been denied, right? Which is strongly affirmed by both St. Thomas and Confucianism. It's very important. Okay. This time? Okay. So the way to philosophy. So I'm going to go through quickly. So the point is that for Confucianism, the way to to perfection of man is the active life, the moral life, right? And for Aquinas, the way toward perfection is the contemplative life, which is what, to use the highest part of man to contemplate the highest being, which is God, right? Whereas for Confucianism, man's perfection is rooted toward development. Okay. For the time being, so I'm going to just go to the comparison. Perhaps in the eyes of Confucianists, the contemplative life is questioned whether it is possible for the vast majority of humanity. And this is why, some scholars suggest that in Confucianism, the ethic is more friendly toward the common people. Whereas, for the Thomist tradition, actually, the contemplative life requires lots of things, right? At least you don't have to worry about making money, or somehow you need a lot of things, basically. So it is questionable, right, whether the contemplative life is possible for the vast majority of humanity, right? But for the Confucian tradition, right, here's a huge problem I see as a Chinese also, that benevolence has very ambiguous relationship with happiness. This is why in all the virtues where Benedict mentioned that they all don't relate to happiness, right? But whereas for Aquinas and Aristotelian tradition, virtue leads to happiness. Why do you pursue virtue? It makes you happy. But it is unclear that in Confucianism, happiness is the end of man. This is why, sometimes, Confucian ethic has been criticized as repressive in the history of China. But disregard their difference, perhaps we can still learn something as modern people from both that. Different from Confucianism, in modern time, morality has become a minimal justice for the sake of human survival. Right? This is really common. That man's perfection, men no longer have a ceiling where he can keep going, but rather morality becomes really the minimal requirement for us to stay together, to kill each other. But for Confucianism, Aquinas, the ceiling for man's perfection is much higher. Different from St. Thomas, that the active life in modern time eventually takes over the contemplative life, or the contemplative life is no longer private. So, we are good on time. So, some observation that I think the two traditions can teach each other a lot, and they also can teach modern men a lot. Where I hope that in the future, as church evangelize China, that the doctrine of the mean can also be applied, right? Even today, when I see the church is being divided between conservative and liberalism, that perhaps the doctrine of the mean can mean something to us, that it's not either or, but in between, right? As the church always insists, the orthodoxy is in between. I remember one place Aquinas mentioned that, but I don't remember exactly. Anyway, thank you so much. And I'm going through quickly, so I hope I'm not making you anxious or crazy.
So, Carl, why don't you sit here also, and Bernadette, you just have a seat, and I'll take questions. And I would invite people to, let's say, we should share the questions between the two. So there could be questions to one of them, or Bernadette, or to Carl, or to both of them. But let's try to ask questions of each as we go on. the discussion. So the floor is open. Father Sherwin.
So thank you both for your presentations. I just get both of you get your thoughts on what's the best English translation of friend, because I'm not convinced that benevolence. There's two different traditions of translating it. I mean, for example, Ren Dao is the way of humanity, but is the accent in Confucianism that humanity is benevolence? It's just not clear to me when the Confucians say that Qian Dao institutes Ren Dao, that the mandate of heaven is to be benevolent. It seems to be a larger notion. But I mean, I just don't know. It's hard for me to understand. So how would you, what do you think is the best English translation of friend? You presented benevolence, but it's often translated humanity, or the human way, or human doctrine, depending on what it's associated, attached.
Yes, I understand the question because there are many different translations regarding the concept of the term friend. And Father said exactly the problem that we have this translation problem. And I agree with you also that the way of humanity is not the exact explanation of the. For me, if you ask my own opinion, I would consider it is love, the human love, because you know that there is the character, which means actually is also with the heart. You have the heart with the way of your heart. So it's a kind of love, the presentation of love. For me, love is the best explanation of these words. It is explaining the perspective of virtue, because also there is different perspective of explaining reality.
I agree with you.
Yes, you.
Thank you so much for the previous presentation, first of all. And it seems that both of you emphasize that in China, the characteristic for the characterization of Chinese culture or thoughts, even religiosity, is more practical rather than transcendental. Then I think as a kind of list for all of us here, because there's a gap between human being and heaven or God. And we try to connect or unify. And then somehow in Christianity we have this idea of sacredness and holiness, which is not only attributed to God, but at the same time human being with earth. That's why we have idea of a saint that's kind of related to sacredness. And in Chinese thought, definitely there's, I think this, as you mentioned, the unification of heaven and human. There's a connection between these two different levels of beings in the world. And I wonder whether this similar idea of sacredness, which we can apply both in heaven and human in Chinese thought, with virtue or philosophical ideas.
I think that the sense of transcendence in Chinese philosophy is not as strong as in the West, and in terms of Christianity, and also in terms of metaphysics. Right? This is why I think Chinese philosophy had a cosmology, but I'm not sure they have a metaphysics, or at least in the Aristotelian sense, where Aristotle talks about metaphysics is after physics, is that after the natural philosophy, right, you reach metaphysics. There are cosmologies that study the world, but I'm not sure they have this Aristotelian metaphysics. This is why, when Buddhism came to China, it was so interesting because they have a great understanding of metaphysics, but to a point where it somehow it so emphasized the other worldliness where some Confucianists think we gotta fight the fact because this renders the political authority not stable, right? I'm not sure I answered your question.
Yeah, please, brilliant.
Thank you for the question because it is what we actually the most important thing to concern. And as part of the sharing origin was this 10 dot and Ren dot and the mandate of heaven through human way. Because the bridge to build up between heaven and human beings is the virtue. But as our brother said already now, and the human virtues, that's the goal of happiness. But as religious, the happiness is with God, the vision. But for Chinese, for human beings, and the happiness without God is just human happiness without transcendental concept. So the main goal for our own opinion is to find out what is the ultimate good, bonum. What is exactly the bonum? So as when I said the bonum, the happiness is through loving God. So that when we introduce to Chinese, we have to introduce this God is a person. It's not something abstract like principle, like laws and rules, but it's a person. As an object that we can love. I think the most important thing is to introduce that God is love in the Holy Trinity. Because in Chinese explanation, we also have Qi, meaning the spiritual, and also logos, as Father already mentioned, Christ, logos like that. Also, Father have like food, but we don't have an exact concept of Trinity. If we introduce them, the Trinity, the mystery of Trinity, which is the persona, I think it is the way that we can introduce to our philosophy.
Yes, here.
Yes, we talking about Thomas Aquinas and different philosophers, including Confucius. I think German people call Confucius. I noticed that throughout the world where China goes, they tend to implement the Confucianism into practices on behalf of Chinese religion. Are they trying to change the belief of the people in China or the public in general? That is a new way of practice in general for the Chinese people or also for people on the planet? It seems that they focus on Confucianism as a way of new practice, new moral teaching, and new belief. And is that the purpose?
Transforming a new religion, or is it? I do not understand the reason behind that. And also, we compare Thomas Aquinas and also Kongzhi. Why are we comparing that? We notice that Confucius is almost like, to many people, they look as one of the god. I know he's a philosopher, a teacher, but it's like one of the god that is represent or stand as one of the Buddha or one of the Jesus Christ. But we are standing and comparing this as one of the philosophers, rather one of the main eminent powers. Is that a reason why we study the level the same?
From my perspective, I think there are two reasons. One is political, the other one is cultural. I think the Chinese government intentionally wanted to encourage the revival of Confucianism for purposes that are not Confucian. To be careful with others. The second thing is that I think the second reason is that there is an attempt among the Chinese Confucianist scholars to rebuke their Chinese identity and moral system. So I think two levels. So Whether this is successful or not, I'm not sure. So, but we do see that during the in the last 20 years, people somehow lost in this relative or nihilistic thoughts, and people realize really the root. Even like I read an interview with Charles Tyler, the author of Secularism. We talk about in this time, in this life, we may see the end of secularism. So people are looking for identity and root apparently because modern narratives do not satisfy.
Yeah, of course.
Just very good question, because what is the difference between the religion and actually it's only a philosophy, as we know. And besides the political and cultural perspective, I would like to answer with a historical perspective. Actually, Confucianism as a religion, it doesn't exist as a religion because Wu Jiao, in Chinese is like a religion. We call Jiao Hui is the church, so Jiao. But actually, this term comes from Korea. The Korea who developed the Confucianism and become Wu Jiao. But this Jiao is not what we understand. Jiao is the church. It is only a philosophy. It's a philosophy. So because of this term, and then there's a big development from Korea, from Japan, and then comes back to the new Confucianism, and then they consider Confucius is the same. And as the same, it's like our church, we worship and devotion and pray to Him. And then there is the religion. It comes out, and after, as what he said, it turns to another practice.
Let me have a follow-up question. So, in what reason that some of the scholars that postulate or have conveyed Confucianism as somehow religious? What makes some of the scholars refer Confucianism as a religion? What part of? Because I noticed that there's no doubt that Confucius' teaching has been rooted in almost every culture in Asia, and that's what is the norm that keep all culture in line with each other. So we talk about the historical part. It has been deep-rooted in almost every Asian family. And I think that is what holds most of the cultural intact together. And to the point that some scholars have referred Confucianism as a religion. So
I agree with Benedetti's assessment that Confucianism is not a religion. But why it is viewed as religious for two reasons, I think. I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
First is that ancestor worships. You have Confucian intellectuals. You also have people who are influenced by Confucian values. And ancestor worship somehow connects to this afterworld. Right? The second reason is sacrifice to the heavens. We know that in Beijing there is a temple of heaven where the emperor goes there every year to make a sacrifice specifically for heaven. So sacrifice also is present in all major religious texts. Confucius texts, especially Li Ji, right? Li Ji has specific books with regard to sacrifice. Even Confucius himself says that, 祭神如神在. I make sacrifice as if gods are real, right? But I don't think in the end I agree with religion is not.
Okay.
I think for Confucius, we think religions are important in terms of their social functions, but not in terms of their reality.
That's my last question. The promotion of Confucianism throughout the world by China now, even within China, is that to promote a new status of ideology And because Buddhism doesn't seem to be the notion of Chinese promotion of religion. So is Confucianism is a new trend of belief for the Chinese. I know that it's not religion, but is that how it is for the Chinese now?
Yes.
Okay.
But I don't think it's about successful.
Why not successful? It has been rooted in every family already, and I think that's part of the moral teaching, living, practice. You don't have to teach them; it's already innate part of their family thing. That
It's difficult.
Well, yeah, I
okay.
think maybe the answer is that the Emperor of Heaven also still thinks that the Confucian tradition can help him expand his reign. I want to make a couple of observances. These aren't comments, but I invite you to respond. It actually links to your important observation and to something from the previous question. So the first observation is about something very profound that Carl noted, which is that it sounds very much as if Confucianism in its classical philosophical vision underscores that there's a harmony of nature that includes not just physical nature or living things that are not persons, but also agents of virtue. That's to say, human personal agents in their decisions and reasoning. So there's a kind of deep notion of nature that includes something personal. And in the quote from the I Ching that you didn't read, but which we could read on the board, it talks about how this passes up into the larger order of heaven. So I understand it doesn't reach into a very explicit metaphysics or a personal conception of God that's overt. And those are messages that can be promoted to complete or extend or challenge the Confucian heritage touchstones. But it does sound like there's an implicit metaphysics, and it's an implicit metaphysics that makes room for personal agency as part of the order of nature, suggesting the possibility of the heavens being something that involves the communion of persons, which goes to the point which was made that, as true, many Asian cultures have this basis of collective Confucianism, which is about keeping an order to promote harmony among persons. It's obviously not Christian, but it isn't entirely opposed to Christian metaphysics of the communion of persons and the order of the world as expressing, this deeper wisdom, which I just thought you were both intimating, but it's worth maybe pointing out. The second thing is just to say that Carl created very briefly, but very powerfully, this idea of a triad of dialogue, a trialogue between Confucian metaphysics or philosophy, Christianity, and then Aquinas. And then thirdly, limitations of modern Western philosophy that has lost a lot of the notion of nature and of God. But I just want to say, this issue of the primacy of contemplation over action that's in Aquinas, that you said was not in Confucianism, does invite a fourth dialogue partner with the Buddhist tradition. Because as you noted, the Buddhist tradition does have the primacy of metaphysics. So even though the metaphysics contrasts or is different from Christian metaphysics in some ways, it is a metaphysics of salvation, of deliverance through enlightenment, and that enlightenment happens in part through contemplation or meditation and awareness of the metaphysical reality of what we are, that leads then to an ethics. And it seems to me there's ways in which Christianity has some resemblances that are more profound in that sense to the metaphysical primacy of metaphysics in the Buddhist tradition, even as it has some connection to the primacy of personal agency and virtue in the Confucian tradition. So I just say that because some of the things you are doing there are very promising, seem to be very promising pathways to create still more resonances of conversation with St. Thomas. Then you don't have to respond to that, but you might. Just two thoughts that came out of listening to you attentively. Father Sherwood.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I thought that the distinction you were making, you might be able to find a way to bring Aquinas and Confucius together on some level, with a conscious distinction between the way of discovery and the way that is proper to the discipline. So that the way of discovery, we begin with what is most evident to us. So that's in harmony with the Confucian view. You try to explain what's less known from what is more well known. The question is, what's the ultimate goal, and then how do you present it in teaching, whether you use a different method. But I think you can make common cause between Aristotle, Aquinas, and the Confucians with regard to the way of discovery. I think they share similar views on that. And then that earlier question of the Tao, Lao Tzu is influencing the Neo-Confucians. So there's a kind of contemplatives in action, where the Neo-Confucians are trying to have a mindfulness in action, which is not the same as traditional Western contemplation, but it's also not mindlessness. It's kind of mindfulness in action. So there are points of contact where
Please.
And yes, Father, my reflection is we have a different approach of explaining human excellence. So if we use the Thomistic traditions, for example, what R said, if my suggestion is we discover the Thomas Aquinas philosophy of being, like a physical wood of explaining human being. I think that is the key of because as our faith, we have, for example, Thomas Aquinas, there is a systematic way to explain anthropology, philosophy, anthropology. But in Confucianism, in general Chinese, we don't have a systematic way to explain human being. There's different approaches, many different approaches. And if we use back the approach of philosophy of being of Thomas Aquinas, I think it is a very good try to try to explain human excellence at the end, to have a harmony between two approaches.
I'd like to thank both our speakers for their very thoughtful and helpful introduction to this important dialogue. So we'll take a break now for probably about 15 minutes. We have coffee and food, and then you're invited back here and probably begin around 4 o'clock. So our next session is on Christian-Buddhist relations, although in different respects, and it follows a similar format where we'll have two presenters and then some time for questions and responses. So I'll introduce our two speakers. The first is Father Will Conquer, who is a French and American priest of the Missions Étrangères de Paris of Paris, ordained for the Archdiocese of Monaco in 2018, and who is a missionary in the Kingdom of Cambodia for the past 3-4 years. He graduated from the Angelicum with a licentiate in theology in, I think, 2019, and it was his idea to host, really, he was one of the people who had the first idea to host Aquinas for Asia in the first instantiation. And so when he was coming back here, it was also his proposal to host this one. And as you can see, he's brought with him some of our esteemed guests from Cambodia who represent the Buddhist and Catholic communities from that country, and they met with the Holy Father this morning, and you can see that they've already been sent out as virtual news to the world. So we're really grateful to them for coming to represent the Cambodian religious community to the Catholic Church and to the Holy Father, and we're grateful to Father Will for bringing them and for them coming to this event today. Father Will speak on the topic conflicting views and converging concerns in regard to our common planet, looking at Jesus' steps and Buddha's footprint. And then, after he has spoken, we'll have Professor Soon Hock Lim. Professor Soon Hock is a representative of many traditions of excellence in his native country of Singapore, where he has been an active leader in the business community and in the academy, in education, and also in political life. He's had a major influence in his native country in brokering structures of mediation and collaboration among different peoples of different race, class, and religious traditions, and has been at the heart of a lot of the thinking about religious coexistence in that country, which, as we know, is a country renowned for many of its great successes. And so it seems appropriate to us to ask him to speak about the topic of creative coexistence in a religious, pluralistic society. So we're really happy to have these two very appropriate representatives of the dialogue between Christianity and Buddhism, and we'll start with Father Will. Thank you.
សូមគោរពជំរាបសួរប្រជាជនគុណជាទីស្រឡាញ់អ្នកអរគ្នាគុណមលីហើយបងប្អូនទាំងអស់គ្នាអរគុណដែលបានចូលរួមកម្មវិធីរបស់យើងនៅថ្ងៃនេះសង្ឃឹមថាមានអត្ថប្រយោជន៍មិនមែនតែសម្រាប់យើងតែប៉ុណ្ណោះប៉ុន្តែសម្រាប់ពិភពលោកហើយសម្រាប់ភាពរភាពហើយមិត្តភាពរវាងគ្រិស្តសាសនានិងពុទ្ធសាសនា Today it's a great honor for me to be back here, and it's a bit of a humiliating experience because I just realized how smarter people have become and how much I've forgotten. And it's just such a pleasure to be back in a place that is looking for the truth in the footsteps of Jesus Christ in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas. Thank you so much, Father Thomas Joe's wife, for accepting this encounter. And this is the second of our seminars, and we're doing a third one that you don't know about. And it was Matthew Levering in March in the United States. And I hope that this is starting a movement because in Asia there's such a great need for a renewal of theology and encounter with our brothers from different traditions. So hopefully this can be another footstep in that sense. I'll just introduce briefly who I'm here with because you might not know. I am with the people on this picture, and we were blessed to have a private audience with the Pope this morning. And I'm traveling with San Sochea, who is a venerable monk from Cambodia. He's currently living in Australia, but he's very respected, very listened to in Cambodia. This is his page. So if you think there's only about 50 people or less in this room, there's already 2,000 people who are liking and following our conversation. And this is a page of San Sochea where everything he does is says and commented, and that was us this morning with the Pope. That's San Sochea, who really impressed me with his open-mindedness and his desire to join this program. The second is Meng Lee Ji Quack, who is a Cambodian American citizen, half American like me, the better half, not the better half, one of the good halves. The two halves are good. And here is his better half, his wife, and Meng Lee is married and has 2 daughters and is a great friend and an inspiration for me and for all his millions of followers in Southeast Asia, especially in Cambodia. This is a book that Meng Lee wrote called Dongrik Mountains, where Meng Lee shares his experience of going from being a refugee who fled the horrors of communism and escaped as a refugee to Thailand before being welcomed to America, where he became a doctor and decided to go back to his country in 2002 to help build the kingdom again. We're blessed to live in a beautiful country called Cambodia, which is a free kingdom where religion is respected, where freedom is guaranteed. And I've been living there for the past 3 years after leaving the Angelicum. It's been an incredible blessing. And I'm blessed to be here with all of them as we travel to Europe to think of a theme called detachment, conversion, and caring for a common home. So the theme that I would like to talk to you about today is caring for a common home in the footsteps of Jesus Christ and of the Buddha. You know, in Rome, there's a place called Quo Vadis, and you go to the church there, and you can see the footsteps of Jesus Christ, you know, because Jesus appeared to Peter, and we see that it's as if Jesus had come to Rome. In Cambodia also, many places you can see the footsteps of the Buddha, even though historically he never came, but it's kind of like a sign of his presence, you know. It's a sign that Buddhism has stepped on the land of Cambodia. What I'm going to talk to you about now is I'm going to try to answer the fact that there is an issue at hand. Cambodia is a beautiful country, but Cambodia is a country that a friend of mine who was just outside told me has an almost untouched environment. You can go to pristine forest like in Prey Long, where we went with another influential monk called Kusopia, who is a friend of Ming Li and of San Sochea. But we realize that the environment in Cambodia is threatened. And as Pope Francis says, it is our common home. So how can we care for it? I'm going to try to answer this question because we have to realize that the answer provided by religions has been challenged. It's been challenged as Christians, we know for many years, and I will show that, I will explain this. But it's being challenged also in a book that came out in 2020. In this conference, very briefly, we'll try to propose a rebuttal to this book, which is a direct attack against the legacy of Buddhism in Southeast Asia. It's called the Buddha's Footprint. So it goes from this footprint of Buddha, and it gives an environmental history of Asia, accusing Buddhism of being partly responsible for the destruction of the environment in Asia. Is that true? Can that be sustained? Or could we answer? So out of friendship for my Buddhist friends and also out of concern for my own religious mission, I will try to answer this question to show that the attacks made in this book came out in 2020 from California, Berkeley, another great place in California. Well, I will try to answer the question and try to see how we can together provide an answer and see what religion has to say for the environment. Pope Francis, in his encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, number 201, says, "The majority of people living on our planet profess to be believers. This should spur religions to dialogue among themselves for the sake of protecting nature, defending the poor, and building networks of respect and fraternity. In a spirit of friendship, Buddhists and Catholics in Cambodia have for a long time collaborated for the safeguard of our common planet. However, as I just said, recent scholarship challenges our mission. While Cambodia faced a terrible humanitarian crisis in the refugee crisis of the last century, St. John Paul II and the Venerable Mohago Sananda emerged as prophets for their calls to treat asylum seekers with humanity. In the wake of an environmental crisis, a new prophetic response is needed in the part of religious leaders. However, similar actions may have different and even opposing motivations. So first question, does religion have a footprint? I'll first answer on the Buddhist side and then on the Christian side. On the Buddhist side, I'll try to summarize the argument raised by this author called John Evelskog, who is a scholar who used to be a Buddhist, one of those neo-Buddhists, who thinks Buddhism is cool, doesn't know much about it, and then gets angry about it because he realizes he didn't know anything, and he gets angry about what he thought he knew, realizing he knew almost nothing. And so he gets very angry against Buddhism, and he says, that while Buddhism is still accepted by many as a religion that promotes harmony, not only among men, but also between men and their environment, he raises a critical voice, accusing Buddhism of having a negative footprint on the environment. He says that Buddhism was a prosperity theology centered on the generation of wealth. Making money was a fundamental part of being Buddhist. Producing wealth created positive karma. Using that wealth to support the Dharma increased merit. Even if monks renounced the material world and refrained from killing animals, most Buddhists did not. Thus, as Everskog points out, I quote, "In order to fully appreciate the footprint of the Buddhist tradition and the history of Buddhist Asia, the activities of the lay community need to be brought for the front and center of our analysis." For Buddhism to function properly, he has three arguments. I'll only answer one of them, which is a more philosophical argument. The first argument is economical. He says in order to support the community, if some people don't work, some people have to work more to support. They do through offerings and merit-making celebrations, or people have to generate a surplus, and that creates extra activity. And so he says, in some way, that's an economic argument. The second argument is social. He says that there's a hierarchy in Buddhism, in the karma, where, on top of the hierarchy is the Buddha. And the Buddha is a man who is above other men, above the woman, above the created, above everything else. And so he says there's kind of a disrespect, which is actually very easy to answer. And I think San Sochea will answer that question very easily. But the third argument is more difficult. It is the environmental case against the physical impermanence. According to Elfskergog, nature earns little notice in the Buddhist teaching. But when nature does appear in an early Buddhist text, it is typically in terms of impermanence, decay, and as something to be avoided. A practical illustration of this philosophy of impermanence may have, I'll just give this example to explain this, that as Cambodia switched from Hinduism to Buddhism, from Vedic religions to the religion of the Buddha, well, they went from temples made of stone, made to last forever because the gods are eternal, to temples made of wood that will not last more than a few hundred centuries because everything passes. As Father Sherwin said in his talk, how can a religion that promotes the extinction of the self not induce the extinction of the world? So it's a really difficult argument that he makes against impermanence. The other arguments are more easy to answer, but I believe that the easiest answer is, as I will say in the second part, going back from the Buddhist to the Buddha, from, what has been done to what the Buddha did. If we return to the Buddha, we see, well, contrary to what he said in his first argument, again, the economic argument, Buddha had no possession and raised that as a model. He had a stability of life in a world which is impermanent. His life is stable. The life of the Buddha is very stable. The life of monks is very stable. Even though San Sochea is traveling with us, like most monks, they're in their monastery. For all the Vosa season, they do not even go out of their monastery. They're really present in their monastery. And they live also in the middle of nature, as Buddha did. And most of the moments of the Buddha's life happen in nature. And you see in the deer garden, and all the great moments of Buddha's life is under trees or close to trees, and especially the Dampot, the holy tree of Buddhism. So secondly, does Jesus have a footprint? Quo vadis? Interestingly, it's almost the same arguments that are made against Christianity. Those developed in 2020 in this book against Buddha's footprint have been developed since the 1990s, criticizing Christianity of exploiting nature rather than serving nature, drawing, of course, mostly on sociological, economic, and also sociological arguments. The sociological and economic arguments can go back to Max Weber and the spirit of capitalism and seeing how Christianity is connected with the spirit of exploitation. And it's been criticized for a long time. In a 2008 book, Francisco Benzoni, who writes Ecological Ethics of the Human Soul, Aquinas, Whitehead, and the Metaphysics of Value, Benzoni says, Aquinas and his theology reflect a strictly instrumental understanding of other creatures, which is insufficient to ground environmentalism and care for creation as it is understood today, especially with the notion of biodiversity. It is inapt to offer a framework to ground an adequate ecological ethic. The claim, of course, is in rebuttal of the argument that was made by Jenkins. Willis Jenkins, who wrote in the early 2000s a beautiful kind of ecological vision of the world in a Thomistic trend, and I'll try to build on him. Again, the arguments against this instrumentalization of creation can be rebutted by returning to Jesus as we return to the Buddha. Jesus, as the Buddha, had no possession, had a stable life, and lived in the middle of nature as he, lived his life's hours in the Garden of Olives. Yet, he had power over nature in a way that was different from the Buddha. And that shows also a different relationship between the environment and the human being, as we believe, and that's my answer in number 2, a difference between us and Buddhists is that we are creationists. We believe in creation. We believe that the relationship of the human being and the environment is a relationship also of creation. So secondly, I would argue that religion does not have a footprint, but rather footsteps. Firstly, in the Buddhist context. In the Buddhist context, the word in Khmer, in Cambodian, is Savayak. It comes from the Sanskrit Savaka or the Sravaka in the Balay, Pali, Savayak, which means a hearer. So it's important to understand that there is always a need to go back to the reality. Everest Cog judges Buddhism on Buddhist rather than going back to the Buddha. And I think that's a fallacy because you're judging a history rather than a doctrine, a practice rather than a theory. And so, in my perspective, it's important to go back to understanding that Buddhists are followers, as we said, not of a way, but of a person, of a teaching, of someone called the Buddha. So for me, it's very important to understand this and to see that a very beautiful example of those footsteps is the birth of Buddha himself. I don't know if you know, but at his birth, Buddha, according to a tradition, according to the Buddhist scriptures, was born and walked on 7 lotus flowers, no? And for me, this footprint is the true footprint of the Buddha, which means a very light footprint on the world. It's a beautiful image of what this footstep should be. And if we want to walk those 7 footsteps, which are symbolic of Buddhist virtues, we need to walk in a way that is least detrimental to our environment, as Buddha walking on lotus flowers, respecting his environment. This translates into the fundamental notion of Buddhism, which is ahimsa, which Monsignor Indunil talked about when we went to the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. Ahimsa, non-violence, means non-violence towards our creation, which means not breaking, not hurting, not deteriorating our environment. How do we answer as Christians? As Christians, we will answer differently. Ahimsa, whereas Christ, of course, was a non-violent person, ahimsa is not a Christian concept. So how do we answer that as Christian? Well, first we have to give rebuttal to the arguments made against Christianity, that a hierarchy of creation is a ladder of shame, that man imposes himself to creation. There's something so beautiful in the optimism of St. Thomas Aquinas on his treatise of creation, where he says that he talks about degrees. And those degrees are degrees in which we are more perfect, not less perfect. We are not Platonists that believe in the decadence of emanations, but we are Catholics who believe in the participation of a greater goodness. So the hierarchy of creation is not a ladder on which we look down on each other, but we look up to each other and up to heaven. So in the question 47, Article 2, where there's a multitude of distinction of things come from God, well, it does. And Aquinas says, each of the one of the species is more perfect than the others. That's the first point. The second point is that if we look in question 76 of the Prima Pars on the Article 3, again in the Treaty on Creation, is a very difficult question to answer for Aquinas, how different species relate to each other, and how we as humans who don't believe that we're not pantheists, how do we respect creation? It's an interesting argument that he makes, and we see that it's a difficult question already for Aquinas. We cannot impose environmentalism of the 21st century on a middle-aged philosopher and theologian, but we can try to see roots and germs of elements that can help us develop a modern theory to answer the questions of our world. I see that for Aquinas, already at that time, the question is difficult. His respondeo in that question 76, Article 3 is one of a very long one compared to the one you usually see, with a lot of arguments. Already in the objections, he raises not 3, but 4 objections, which is more than the usual 3. He is one of his strongest Aristotelian arguments against Platonism. Aquinas argues that the soul of man is both different and similar to the animal soul, with a triple distinction, which respects the created soul of every animal. Man has an animal soul, but he is also human. He goes and quotes on the treaty of Aristotle, which we saw yesterday in the Vatican museums, walking and looking for the truth with Plato. And we see that. So he talks about this triple distinction of the soul, and that he roots, according to Aristotle, in the distinction between the 3 sources of substance, between matter, potentiality, form, actuality, and the compound of matter and form. And there is a nested hierarchy of the functions of the soul, which are growth, locomotion, and intellect. And this gives us 3 corresponding degrees of the soul, which are the nutritive soul, which is shared by everything living, even the plants, the nutritive soul. We need to grow, we need to survive, we need to feed ourselves and grow. The second is a sensitive soul, which is that of animals. Animals not only have a nutritive soul, but also a sensitive soul. And so we share that with all the animals. Animals have, you can hurt them. Animals feel pain. Animals feel separation. And the rational soul, the third level, is proper to humans, which is our honor as human beings to have not only to share this nutritive soul with all the living beings, to share the sensitive soul with all the animals, but to also have the privilege of the rational soul, which is our connection with God as we were created in His image. Thus Aquinas makes this notion that in man the sensitive soul, the intellectual soul, and the nutritive soul are numerically one soul. Thus he beautifully concludes that neither is Socrates a man by one soul and an animal by another, but by one and the same soul he is both animal and man. Thomas Aquinas provides the architecture for later James Schaffer, who will build on these themes to found an effort to ground the green theology of the Catholic faith, valuing the goodness and beauty of creation, respecting creation's praise of God, acknowledging the kinship of all creatures, using creation with gratitude and restraint, and living virtuously within the human community and the earthly community. In the final chapter of his book, Schiffer, who wrote Theological Foundations for Environmental Ethics, reconstructing patristic and medieval concepts in 2009, Schiffer will develop the Thomistic notion of human as a virtuous cooperator, drawn from the teachings of Aquinas. Virtuous cooperator, that's where we link in with ahimsa, with the nonviolence concept. Man cannot do evil, and man should do good. This will maybe help create a response to a world in despair in an endangered age. That's the third question. And that's more questions that I will raise, and maybe San Sochea will answer those questions. Are we walking together in these footsteps, or are we walking apart? The first element is maybe we're walking together. The most beautiful image of that is a friendship that exists between the Dalai Lama and Thomas Merton. Monastic life, in a way, is our model of detachment, where we find each other, and in practical things, we connect. The life of San Sochea is not so different in practical terms from that of a Benedictine monk. The prayers are different, but the time schedule is very close. However, our understanding of it is quite different. For a notion like celibacy, which is so important to all of us here as religious people, people see today not having kids as an environmental thing. Are we celibate out of a neo-Malthusian philosophy? Are we celibate because it's more environmental? For Buddhist, celibacy puts an end to the cycle of reincarnation. But for us Christians, we don't have a negative vision of celibacy. It bears fruit in a life and in the next. For us as Christians, celibacy, though we live it in the same way, we try to struggle to stay faithful to it, we live it with very different motivations. So, and that's my conclusion point, there is a necessity for a philosophy of life. If we cannot share the same theological grounding, we need to try to work together for a philosophy of life, aware of the urgent need of conversion in order to safeguard our common home. Can this conversation that we're having on this trip be fooled by the same fire? I believe that we need to talk of conversion as detachment. And that's my question for you, San Sochea. What does Nikam Baramai, Nikam in Buddhism, have to do with the Fuga Mundi of us as Christians? How can we care for creation if we don't care for ourselves? How can we understand that? I believe that we can only preach conversion as an act of love. How can this enlightenment come about? For Christians, it can happen with grace. A change of attitude needs to come from a change of the heart. And ecological conversion will come by a conversion of love. This grace is an inspiration that can also be mediated by men and by women. And as such, inspirational leaders have a responsibility in that sense. Leaders on Facebook, leaders on social networks have a mission to promote this conversion. That our contemporaries may aspire to what religious leaders can inspire. So, what I propose, as we're not arrested as a big show like our dear friend Greta Thunberg, who would only put shame on you as we talk about environmental conversion. Rather than shame, I'd rather put hope. I would rather propose and suggest lovingly, rather than impose shamefully, the need of a greater conversion, not only for the good of our planet, but for the good of all of our humanity. If you have time, San Sochea, please come forward and tell us, just for you, how you would understand this detachment as detachment from the world, whereas we understand it out of love. How do you understand the notion of Nikama Baramai in a few words.
Hello everyone. Straight to the question about the Nekama Barami. It is Pali term. It means the renunciation. The renunciation is referred to how we develop our understanding to eradicate the defilements from our mind, our consciousness. I think every religious leader, the top religious leader, they cannot become the great person or God without renunciation or without Nekama Parami. Like Jesus Christ, he donated all things, even his life, for all beings' happiness. And also Buddha, he have cultivated many lives, the virtue or the Nekama Barami, not only one life. It is a eon that cannot count how many lives that he had done many things to develop his perfection to be the Buddha. There are 10 perfections altogether, but Nekama Barami is one of the 10 perfections. Those who are cultivate the Nekama Barami, they have to give up 3 things. One thing is called in Pali term Kama Vitaka. You know the word Kama Vitaka. It is about sensuous thinking or eliminate the sensual pleasure with all things. And the second one is called Psiyabada Vitaka. It is thinking of hate. So those who cultivate this perfection is develop the mind to abandon all hatred thing from the mind. So the one who can bring peace to the world, he have to eliminate all hatred in the mind. If he keep the thing of hate in the mind, he cannot bring peace to the world. And the last one is called Vihansa Vidaka. It is cruelty thinking. So all top leader of the religion, I think they all cultivate this perfection. They give up everything to bring peace and harmony to the world, because every activities in their life, they never do it with attachment, but they do it with love and compassion. They're living for sharing, not for demanding. They only bring peace to the world. So, like what we have discussed about Mother Nature, we live in this planet. Why we don't live in the moon? Why we cannot live in other planet? Because in the moon there is no tree, no water, no life. So our life always connected to the nature. Like when we breathe in and breathe out, we cannot live only with the wind that go inside and come out, but with oxygen. We as human beings, we cannot produce oxygen. Everything come out from our body is not oxygen at all. What to call when
Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide.
carbon dioxide, yes. But only the nature can produce it, can make it, and can create it. So that is why we have to take care of our mother nature, because we never win. If we destroy the nature, we will be destroyed by the nature, like earthquake, flood, many things. The heat is increasing every day because many people cut the tree. Related to the Buddha step, the Buddha footprint. For me, I am a Buddhist monk. It is like this letter. It is called Pico. So 4 Pico are not allowed to cut the tree at all. Even 1 tree are not allowed. So even when they are allowed to build a small house in the forest for practice meditation, Buddha allowed only a very small, maybe called cottage or something like for, yes, or whatever, but not too big. Only when we can decorate 1 bed only, because Buddha don't allow people to destroy the tree a lot. And if someone used to learn the Buddha story, even the day he was born was also in the forest, and the day that it got enlightenment was also in the forest, and the day that he passed away was also in the forest. I remember one sutta that his disciple asked him, "My Lord, why don't you choose any city for your last time before you pass away? Why don't you choose any city or where surrounded by people?" Buddha said, city or forest are the same, because thousand years ago, this place used to be a very big city. But when the time passed by, everything is changed. So to him, city or forest, nothing different. But he preferred forest rather than the city. So, what to say more? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank Rector Father Thomas Joseph and the university for inviting me to speak to you. It is my pleasure to talk about creative coexistence in a religious pluralistic society, as suggested by Father Thomas. I think the topic is more relevant and even more important than ever before. In today's world of prolific fake news, pervasive social media, and persistent human conflicts, despite many lessons learn from history. Now let me start by doing what all good professors do. Anyone would like to guess what I've done? Any volunteer?
Define.
Sorry.
Definition. Definitions.
Definition. That's correct. You read my mind, brother. I did some internet research just to make sure that I get the definition correct. So it's not just my definition, but really, trying to assimilate what I gathered from the internet, and this is what I define religious pluralism. I think it refers to the idea that multiple religions can coexist within a society, and that individuals should be free to practice their own religion without interference or discrimination. Easier said than done. Right? Father Wills talk about walking together or walking apart. Now, what about creative coexistence? Creative coexistence in a religious pluralistic society involves finding ways for people of different religions to live and work together harmoniously, respecting and valuing each other's beliefs and practices. So what I'm going to share with you is more down to earth, and certainly not in the realm of philosophy, which all of you have been exposed up to now. Now, the topic also presupposes that creative coexistence is constructive and not destructive, and requires an open and inclusive mindset and a willingness to seek out and engage with people of different faiths and beliefs. So on that note, I would now like to share with you my personal thoughts and opinions on the subject based on the Singapore model. Now, what I will share with you is my personal prognosis. Although I have held various appointments as my contribution to public service on a voluntary basis for over 25 years, I do not represent the Singapore government. So I repeat, I do not represent the Singapore government. Having been born and brought up in Singapore, I've experienced and lived through several monumental epochs of Singapore history, from the 50s to today, over 7 decades, and my white hair is proof of that. For example, the first calamitous racial riots in 1964. No, correct. This one. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I don't have stage fright, but I do. Now, the agenda for my sharing will cover the following: a brief history and background of Singapore, the holistic approach taken by Singapore through policies and laws, as well as an economic blueprint, and finally, the role of leadership, given that I'm a professor of leadership and entrepreneurship at our National University of Singapore. In July 1964, Singapore had our first major racial riots between the Chinese and Malays. Less than 1 year after Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia, which included Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak. So for many of the Asians here, you can identify with the countries, especially our Malaysian friend here and our Cambodian friend. Right. No one in Singapore expected this to happen. No one. Until this tumultuous upheaval that crippled the entire nation, the different races were living together in peaceful coexistence since the founding of Singapore. The riots were triggered by clashes between Malay and Chinese youth during a procession organized by the Malays to celebrate Prophet Muhammad's birthday. Unfortunately, set in an environment where racial tensions were already running high, incited by political extremists and the media. Although it happened during a religious event, religion wasn't the primary cause. I repeat, religion wasn't the primary cause. It was politically instigated along racial lines. Malaysia had a Bumiputra policy to accord special rights to Malays. That policy still exists today. Lee Kuan Yew, then our first Prime Minister, was advocating a Malaysian Malaysia, where every citizen will be treated equally, which upset the central government in Malaysia and Malay interest groups. Malay political extremists saw Lee Kuan Yew as a threat, and through further incitement of anti-Chinese sentiments, exploited the celebration to trigger a racial riot. Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia in 1965 and is no longer part of the Federation, existing now as a republic. Now, what is clear is that racial and religious harmony is extremely fragile, and politicians will exploit it for political gains, even though they are aware that they are playing dangerously with fire. Sorry, I've got to get used to the mouse here. Sister, is there a better way for me to...
If you click it, Professor, you
No, I haven't clicked it. I want to bring the arrow. Oh, sorry. Now, developing and building creative coexistence in a religious pluralistic society is not easy. Hard truths and realities are obstacles that need to be recognized and overcome. Fault lines always exist in a multiracial and multi-religious society. It is extremely more challenging to achieve multi-religious unity in a heterogeneous, i.e. multi-racial society compared to one that is homogeneous. I was sharing with the professor outside, even in India, where you've got a homogeneous society, you have frequent clashes between the Muslims and the Hindus. And it is almost impossible to separate race from religion, and vice versa. And the challenge is further complicated by class discrimination. We cannot expect people to treat others of diverse religious beliefs equally, subconsciously or otherwise. And it's largely a question of degree due to our cognitive systems of biases and prejudices. And in a world full of deception, some of these are self-inflicted because of bias and prejudices, and some because of trust in others who have different motives. Finally, a rigid dichotomy between social good and political goals and capital will always exist. And in that sense, I would advocate that all politicians must rise above self-interest and move towards what I call self-exceeding. In other words, putting self-interest aside, but looking at what you can do for the social good. The July 1964 racial riots played a significant role in shaping some of Singapore's fundamental principles, such as multiculturalism and multiracialism, once Singapore had gained independence from Malaysia in 1965. For example, our Internal Security Act grants the executive powers against actions that may threaten the internal security of Singapore, including those that promote feelings of ill will and hostility between different races or other classes of the population, like religious groups, likely to cause violence. And Lee Kuan Yew declared that we are going to have a multiracial nation in Singapore. We will set the example. This is not a Malay nation. This is not a Chinese nation. This is not an Indian nation. Everybody will have his place. Equal language, culture, and religion. So as a multiracial society, Singapore has inherited a legacy of different religious beliefs, practices, and traditions. To achieve creative coexistence in a religious pluralistic society, a country needs to find ways to accommodate diversity, such as through laws and policies that protect the rights of individuals to practice their religions and express their beliefs. This is what Singapore has done, introducing laws and policies to promote and preserve racial and religious harmony. The Singapore Constitution emphasized the need to adopt non-discriminatory policies based on race and or religion. Furthermore, the state also guaranteed the grant of minority rights and to ensure that the minorities in Singapore are not mistreated. The Maintenance of the Religious Harmony Act was drafted and implemented in 1990. Furthermore, there is the Presidential Council for the Minority Rights, which was established in 1970 to ensure that the bills